Hi friends, two sisters decide to build a life from scratch deep in the woods using only basic hand tools. They leave city life behind and start building their dream house with their own hands. There is no electricity, no internet. You will be amazed when you watch this video. Here we go. Two sisters have dug their first pickaxe to build their own house from scratch on this isolated plot of land in the woods. In this scene, thick concrete columns driven into the ground begin to rise. Each one is poured individually using molds made from wooden planks the sisters carry by hand. With all the columns now lined up, a magnificent floor plan begins to emerge. Incredible! With the foundation columns complete, the two sisters immediately moved on to the next phase. Now it is time to install the main support lines that form the house's framework. They shoulder the wooden planks one by one and place them on the concrete columns. Every piece is carefully measured, and every connection is meticulously secured. The two sisters now move on to the most critical phase of creating the heart of the house, preparing the rebar. In this scene, they manually separate and arrange hundreds of twisted rebar pieces on the ground, patiently beginning their assembly. Using pliers, they secure each piece of rebar, each cut to the same size, to create a strong iron cage. This isn't just a structure, it is a feat of engineering. They then carefully place the rebar on the house's platform. That platform is no longer just flat ground, it becomes a durable structure that dissipates vibrations as people step on it.
the iron cages were carefully placed, the irreversible step began, pouring the concrete. The sisters took a final look at the reinforcement, measuring the ground meter by meter. There must be no gaps, no shifting. Then dozens of bags of cement were shoveled into the piles of sand. There were no mixers, no cranes. Everything was moved by hand in sectioned wheelbarrows.
Once the concrete base has dried, it is time for the exciting step where the structure begins to rise, the brick walls. The moment these two determined brothers smell the mortar, they get to work. First, they load the bricks one by one into a wheelbarrow and then patiently transport them to the work area. Then, with the demeanor of a bricklayer, they apply the mortar with millimeter precision, meticulously fitting each brick into place. The first row, which begins with a natural view reflected in the lake, quickly rises, floor by floor. walls rose, revealing window and door openings. Now came the most challenging yet exciting phase, building the roof. The sisters carried the planks one by one and placed them on the sloping surface. Balancing was difficult, but not impossible for them. Each surface of the roof was carefully clad, then iron reinforcement was installed, extending to the very top. A roof covered inward as far as the eye could see was now reinforced with a sturdy iron mesh. On this sloping surface, which was difficult even to stand on, they took measurements, swung hammers, and bent wire. This wasn't just a roof, it was a shelter against rain, wind, and time. This structure, built by the hands of two women, is now a true home, rising in the midst of nature. Construction continues unabated. Now it is time for both the roof's final layer and the surrounding improvements. One sister needs the mud-like mortar, while the other balances on the sloping roof, carrying buckets of concrete. This mixture, poured onto iron grates, is carefully spread to increase the roof durability. Each bucket contains more than just mortar, it is also labor. Simultaneously, another hidden structure rises next to the house, an arched underground chamber. This time, the bricks are laid not horizontally, but in a curved plane. This space, likely a storage facility or shelter, is masterfully planned from both aesthetic and engineering perspectives. And the exterior floor, it is being compacted and reinforced with a vibrating machine. The house is now nearly complete. After the underground section is covered with an aesthetically pleasing curve, the brick-adorned exterior walls add character to the house. But the sisters don't stop there. Now it is time to move on to the interior. Once inside, the first task is to install the bamboo supports. These thick poles support the roof and create a natural atmosphere. Then they return to the roof, and this time, the final touch begins, the stone cladding. Kneeling on a sloping surface, right by the pond's edge, they place each stone in place, one by one. The stones, secured with mortar, form the final layer of the roof. Here are the finishing touches. This master craftsman lays the laminate flooring panels with millimetric precision, virtually recreating the floor. He leaves space with small wedges placed along the wall edges, then secures each piece firmly in place with a special, attractive block. With the floor almost finished, he steps inside to inspect the final steps. The finished result, with its pristine, polished wood, is truly exquisite. On the exterior, he secures the glass frame between the stone-clad walls, tightening the screws with his powerful drill to ensure the structure's stability. This process, carried out from beginning to end by himself, leaves everyone in awe.